The year a country almost disappeared forever. For a few months, it existed only on paper, surrounded by forces that expected it to vanish quietly. Maps were redrawn, plans were made, and its future was discussed as if it were already gone. Survival was never supposed to be an option. This story matters today because nations do not always disappear through dramatic collapse or conquest, but through moments when survival seems impractical, inconvenient, or politically unnecessary to those deciding their fate. The process of erasure is often quieter than anyone expects, unfolding through bureaucratic adjustments and diplomatic silences rather than through battles or invasions. At the time, the country was exhausted, weakened by internal division, economic strain, and the lingering damage of earlier conflicts that had drained its ability to respond quickly or decisively. Its institutions were fragile, its alliances uncertain, and its borders increasingly treated as negotiable by stronger neighbors. Powerful states viewed the situation through calculation rather than principle, weighing stability, influence, and advantage while quietly accepting the idea that this country's disappearance might simplify the regional order. In the logic of great power politics, the existence of a small, struggling state was not a moral question, but a strategic one, and the strategic answer pointed toward absorption. Diplomatic conversations moved forward without its representatives, and contingency plans assumed absorption, partition, or quiet replacement rather than survival. Inside the country, uncertainty spread faster than panic, as people sensed that decisions were being made elsewhere, far beyond their control. Confidence eroded as rumors replaced clarity, and silence replaced reassurance. What made this moment especially dangerous was not just external pressure, but the growing belief that resistance might be pointless, that history had already chosen a different outcome. The psychological dimension was as threatening as any military force, because a nation that stops believing in its own future has already begun to dissolve from within. For the first time, survival itself felt conditional, dependent on timing, perception, and whether anyone still believed the country was worth saving. This was the edge of erasure, a narrow space where nations either disappear quietly or find a reason to endure. As the crisis deepened, the mechanisms that usually protect statehood began to fail, with guarantees losing weight and promises dissolving under the pressure of competing interests. Neighbors prepared for outcomes that exclude the country entirely, adjusting military, economic, and diplomatic strategies as if its disappearance were only a matter of timing. International attention shifted elsewhere, and silence from powerful actors became as threatening as open hostility, signaling that intervention was unlikely. The absence of statements, the avoidance of commitments, the careful neutrality of language in diplomatic communications all pointed toward a calculated withdrawal of support that was never formally announced but was clearly felt. Internally, leadership struggled to maintain cohesion, as disagreements over strategy, compromise, and resistance intensified under the weight of existential uncertainty. Some argued that survival required concession, even at the cost of sovereignty, while others believed that any compromise would simply delay inevitable absorption. The debate itself was corrosive, because every hour spent arguing internally was an hour not spent presenting a unified front to the world, and external observers interpreted division as confirmation that the country lacked the cohesion to endure. The population lived in suspension, continuing daily life while sensing that its political existence was being debated without consent or representation. Economic pressure increased as investment stalled, currency weakened, and access to resources narrowed, reinforcing perception that collapse was approaching. The economic deterioration was not just a symptom of the crisis, but an accelerant, as each decline in material conditions made the country appear less viable and therefore less worth preserving in the eyes of those calculating its future. Each passing week without resolution made disappearance feel more plausible, as the absence of decisive support from allies eroded confidence. What made the situation uniquely dangerous was a lack of a clear enemy to resist, because erasure was unfolding through indifference rather than invasion. The country was not being destroyed, but slowly forgotten, and history has shown that forgetting can be just as final as defeat. This was a quiet phase where nations vanish, not in flames, but in silence. The conflict reached its peak when indifference began to turn inward, as citizens questioned whether the country still possessed a will to exist beyond symbols and memory. Public debates intensified, not over policy, but over identity, purpose and whether survival justified the sacrifices now being demanded. The conversation was no longer about strategy or politics. It was about meaning, about whether the idea of this nation carried enough weight to justify the cost of defending it when the rest of the world had moved on. Small acts of defiance emerged, not always coordinated or strategic, but driven by the refusal to accept disappearance as an acceptable outcome. These actions carried risk, because asserting existence could provoke retaliation or accelerate pressure from those who preferred quiet resolution. Yet each expression of resistance disrupted the narrative that erasure would occur smoothly, forcing external actors to reconsider assumptions about compliance. International perception began to shift as survival gained visibility, transforming the country from a passive subject into an unpredictable variable. The build-up reached a critical moment when leadership recognized that ambiguity was more dangerous than confrontation, and that invisibility invited elimination. By choosing to assert presence, even without guarantees of success, the country reframed its situation from inevitable loss to contested survival. This shift did not eliminate danger, but it restored agency, replacing quiet resignation with deliberate risk. History often turns on such moments, when existence is defended not by power, but by refusal. And in refusing to disappear, the country changed how the world calculated its future. The climax arrived when the country's refusal to fade forced the world to acknowledge what had been conveniently ignored, that erasure was not inevitable as long as resistance, however fragile, remained visible. Attention returned, calculations shifted, and what was once treated as settled began to look uncertain. Survival did not come through dramatic rescue or sweeping guarantees, but through the accumulation of moments where disappearance was delayed long enough to become impractical. Time, once the enemy, became an unexpected ally as conditions changed and priorities elsewhere demanded attention. The resolution of this moment lies in understanding that statehood is not preserved solely through strength, but through presence, relevance, and the willingness to assert existence even when success seems unlikely. What almost vanished endured because it refused to accept silence as an ending. This story matters today because many nations, institutions, and identities face similar moments where survival depends less on power and more on visibility and persistence. Being seen, heard, and acknowledged can be the difference between continuity and erasure. History does not always reward the strongest, but it often spares those who insist on remaining part of the conversation. Existence itself can become an act of resistance when disappearance is expected. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The